Hello and welcome to the second instalment of Society Language Difference, our 11-week journey through post-war French philosophy. Now, last week we were looking and thinking and discussing the three H's, and we were looking at the state of play for French thought, but also really across the West in the 40s into the 50s, the problem of fascism. The problem of how advanced civilized societies had degenerated into the worst barbarism imaginable and what that meant. Now, this week, we're going to be looking at a group of thinkers originally based in Germany who end up traveling to the United States and whose thought has a wide influence over a lot of political, cultural, sociological analysis. I think these thinkers are absolutely brilliant. As always, this class comes from my sofa, and over the next hour or so, we're going to take you through the best bits of the Frankfurt School. I hope you enjoy the ride. Right, so this is our agenda. Here is our 1950s housewife, who is going to be subject to a great deal of analysis. We're going to begin with looking at Walter Benjamin. We can just pronounce it in the English way or German way, I don't mind. Walter Benjamin at the border. We're going to use a certain story to begin thinking about the underlying problems that the Frankfurt School were determined to address. Now, if we're going to put one of those problems into a simple question, it would be this: why did the masses desire fascism? Why had so many in Germany, at least, supported authoritarianism? And then what about Russia? What about the spread of fascism in other parts of Europe? We need to really just identify who the Frankfurt School were, and I want to tell you about the big names and the key ideas in this part. In part 4, we're going to look at the Dialectic of Enlightenment, a major 1947 book by a couple of Frankfurt School men, and we are going to work out why is the Enlightenment potentially to blame for the death camps that long follow. We're then going to get into some quite juicy stuff with the culture industry and the analysis that the Frankfurt School increasingly applied to Western capitalist democracies. That culture, that popular culture, could contain within itself a kind of fascism. And what does that mean? In the last part, we're going to look at Herbert Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man, which is the set reading for this week. And we're going to look at what one-dimensional life will consist of and why life or society or even philosophy can be said to only have one dimension. What's at the basis of this unusual critique of society? Well, it draws on something that might seem at first existential, to lack authenticity, to lack dimensions. But what we get with our thinkers is a really interesting fusion of Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx, which is sometimes called Freudo-Marxism. Right, part 1, Walter Benjamin at the border. So let's bring our minds back to last week and the historical context that I sketched out in the first class. We were thinking about the unexpected and all too powerful rise of Nazism that eventually swept over Europe like a tsunami. Because we were thinking about France, we were thinking about what was happening in France and the way that France and its kind of fairly divided society and politics seemed to kind of crumble fairly quickly into the Second World War. It was occupied very quickly, but worse than that, many French were willing to collaborate. There was a free Vichy government. What did that mean for those young French people that weren't willing to collaborate, that did resist and fought in the resistance? Many of those, like Albert Camus, end up becoming major philosophers in their own right. What we're dealing with here is fascism. Now, fascism isn't just about a certain uniform or a certain insignia or long trench coats. Fascism, maybe at its root, is about fear and the response to fear, and the way that certain individuals surrounded by certain men present movements in which our fears are answered, because we are swept up into a powerful movement of history in which our lives suddenly have meaning again, they have purpose, and we are going to exterminate the enemies. Now, fascism was very popular in a lot of Europe, tragically so. What did that mean for Jewish people? What did that mean for Jewish intellectuals? Well, let's look at one. Walter Benjamin. You might have come across his work before. He's a very interesting writer, Jewish, German. Now he's forced to flee Germany in 1933. He's an exile, one of many, from Berlin, who's living in Paris. Now during the 30s, while he's in Paris, he produces a lot of really interesting research. He's working on Charles Baudelaire, the poet. He has this vast project, the Arcades Project, in which he explores Paris as the capital of the 19th century. Now that research, while so much of it exists in notes, it's never fully complete because he's suddenly forced to stop. In 1939, he's actually interned by the French authorities because he's German speaking, even though he's Jewish. He's interned for a bit in 1939. Then in 1940, he's allowed to go back to Paris. But when he gets back to Paris, Nazi soldiers like this are coming in and marching in. And so Walter Benjamin with his sister flee. They flee south. They go to unoccupied Lourdes, where the pilgrimages nowadays take place. Now Benjamin is very unwell. He's got a bad heart condition. It means that he can't walk for more than 10 minutes without needing to stop and take a break for 1 minute. He's not been able to do that much work in the previous year because of it. His sister, who he travels with, has got arteriosclerosis. It's getting worse. They're both Jewish. If they don't leave France in time, they will die. And there is that sense, there is that awareness then that this is what will happen. Now he has been involved with a certain school that we're going to talk about, the Frankfurt School. Some of the members of the Frankfurt School have managed to get him a visa to the United States, but he needs to get out of France first. He reaches Marseille in August 1940, but he hasn't got a visa to exit France legally, so he's stuck. So then, with some other refugees, they attempt to cross the Pyrenees mountains on foot. And this is his next plan. Bear in mind his heart condition, his ill health. He leaves behind his sister. He travels to the border. He hasn't got much with him. He's got a small attaché case. And in this case is a manuscript, a new manuscript, that he says is more important than I am. When he arrives at Port Bou, which is on the border between France and Spain is closed. It's just been closed to illegal refugees. Him and the other refugees are then put under guard at a hotel. Everything suggests that they will be sent back into France and then sent on trains into Germany. Walter Benjamin decides to take his own life. He's brought with him enough morphine to do it, and he succeeds. The next day, that border is reopened. Now, the text that he was working on, more important than his life in that case, is also lost. We don't know what it was. But something that he had been working on around this time were his theses on the philosophy of history. Now, he'd given an earlier version of this to Hannah Arendt, later a major philosopher and his cousin by marriage. And these theses, we have them. They were published in 1942. Now, the theses present a very radical view of human history, in which the idea of progress is, us drifting, us travelling up to greater, societal goodness and peace and harmony, is really really dismissed. Theodor Adorno, who you're going to hear a lot about in this talk, was one of the first to read these theses, and he says that what characterizes them is, above all, the idea of history as a permanent catastrophe, the criticism of progress, the domination of nature, and the attitude to culture. So these are published in 1942, and really they prefigure a lot of what the Frankfurt School are going to write and publish from the late 1940s into the 50s, into the 60s, which is like their heyday, although they had been in operation since the 1920s. Now, one of the other memorable things that Benjamin does in these theses is he talks about an image by Paul Klee, a painting called Angelus Novus, New Angel. Now, Benjamin describes this angel in very moving terms, and he uses this image of the angel to talk about history, to talk about our history, but not just to talk about the past, but to talk about the future. And Benjamin says, A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he's about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed, but a storm is blowing in from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Now we can imagine the effect on Adorno or on many others of reading such work during a time like this, during the 1940s, during the unstopped rise of Nazism, during the failure of Soviet communism to deliver an internationalist project that could guarantee human freedom instead of brutally subjugating it in the most horrific ways imaginable, apart from being exceeded by the horrors of Hitler. Now, Benjamin is trying to make a point here that may be a problem, and this is a bearing on Hegel, who we talked about last week. Maybe there is a problem when people have too much faith that human progress is always going to involve something in which the dignity and value of human life is still respected. You cannot always be so sure that benefits are accruing with each year, with each new event, each new movement. Maybe the opposite. Benjamin says elsewhere that, quote, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Now this really striking duality, civilization or barbarism, is going to come up in other places. It goes back to something which I think is a famous quote by the German Marxist Rosa Luxemburg, who's involved in an uprising in 1919 but is murdered herself in Germany, of the choice that she presents between socialism or barbarism. Now, this itself comes from somebody else. It comes from Karl Kautsky. And in France in the 1950s, there will be an organization of workers and intellectuals called socialism or barbarism. Here it's civilization or barbarism. And the question is simple. Which side are you on? Now, Hannah Arendt is Benjamin's cousin, as I mentioned, and she has quite a powerful way of describing the significance of his work that she ends up writing about much later. Hannah Arendt, as some of you may know, also produces some very interesting work on the origins of totalitarianism, and we might come back to this later. Now, Arendt describes Benjamin as like a pearl picker. When you think about a pearl picker, think of oysters and pearls. Somebody, at least in the old-fashioned way, who would dive down into the deep sea, well, not so deep bit, but into a somewhat deep bit, and would pull those pearls from the oysters, would pick these difficult items of treasure. Arendt says that this is what Benjamin did in relation to the past. He was a pearl picker of the past. She draws on a quotation from Shakespeare's The Tempest. Full fathom 5, thy father lies, off his bones a coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Benjamin described himself in the Arcades project as a rag picker. It's a rag picker, like a rag and bone man, someone who finds rubbish, trash, rags. He's a rag picker of modernity, of the modern period. He finds the rags, he repurposes them, he puts them up for sale. And the lasting question when we read Benjamin, and I encourage you to take a look at his work after this, is what we do with these pearls, with these rags, with this challenge, civilization and barbarism. Now the question that haunted Benjamin and others is this one. Why did the masses desire fascism? I'm not going to give you an answer to that, because I think it's something that the Frankfurt School try and answer, actually. And this is what we'll look at over the rest of this talk. You'll see in the image here, we got a huge rally, Nazi rally from Nuremberg. And we looked at this and thought about this last week. How so many people, it's impossible really to kind of count how many are in this vast image, gathered in orderly lines. And how the Führer, a failed artist, a traumatized military veteran, Adolf Hitler, could be godlike to all of these people, could offer them something so powerful, could allow them to escape their individuality and make them feel part of something much bigger and much more powerful than being an individual, much more powerful than being a lonely and isolated individual in a society dominated by hidden and secret influences, by a Jewish conspiracy, by enemies everywhere. Views of an us against them, which we could see in human nature in different ways, but which certainly become much more ugly in times of recession, in times of an economic downturn, like the late 1920s in Western Europe. Now, Hitler could promise so much. Not just economic success, not just military prestige, but the image of a fatherland. Somebody who could reconstruct the broken family structure, and give everyone a place in a future that would last, a Reich that would last 1,000 years. But of course, when we think about these analyses, we must be careful not to put too much emphasis just on Germany. What about the Soviet Union? What about the rise of Stalin? What about the way in which he used propaganda and fear to conquer, incarcerate, liquidate? That's a very interesting term. Dehumanizes, isn't it? Mass murder his enemies. And all at the same time do this work, which, in previous centuries would have been called tyranny. And in previous centuries, tyrannies are usually assumed to collapse fairly quickly. These tyrannies didn't collapse quickly. They lasted a long time. Stalin's tyranny ends when he dies. Hitler's tyranny ends because he loses in a war to an external enemy. Would they have collapsed without these things? What if Stalin lived another 10 years? He probably would have still been in power. If they didn't have mass support, then they certainly had begrudging mass assent. So what does that mean? In a certain sense, it means that we need to talk about fear. We need to be wary of the centrality of fear to politics. And this is really important. But if we look at these very curious images of Hitler from the the mid-1920s, he's asked somebody to take photos of him while he's practicing his speech. Hitler, the totalitarian leader, is doing something different at the same time. They're channeling, almost kind of like a shaman in a certain way. They're working out how to channel not just fears but desires. Channeling the desire of the German people for prestige and glory after humiliation in the First World War. Becoming somebody so kind of physically powerful in his body and in his kind of what look like bonkers expressions, who seems to kind of not just sum up greatness but a sense of destiny. Really important to people who have lost their jobs and livelihoods in the preceding economic crash, have lost their minds, maybe their limbs, in the preceding and generally entirely meaningless and inconsequential World War, where the same forces go at each other again 20 years later. Why do the masses desire fascism? How do these leaders speak and how are they heard? For the Frankfurt School, we can't just look at this in terms of the First World War. We can't just look at this in terms of economics. It touches on something deeper. What we're dealing with is ideology. We're dealing with the structures in which people think. And to understand those structures, we need to use a mixture of mechanisms. We need to understand psychological mechanisms about how people desire, about how people fear, about how people repress their desires or repress their sexuality, repress their sexual urges, and how they sublimate those urges, and I'm using the language of Sigmund Freud, who was so important to this tradition, into other directions, into higher directions, into higher movements, into mass movements, like Nazism. But not just psychological thought, kind of structure, not just a psychological approach. At the same time, a socio-economic approach, using Karl Marx, looking at how structures of feeling, looking at how the ways groups think is shaped by their economic position in society. We need to have both. And this is what the Frankfurt School are really offering. Now, our next part, introducing the Frankfurt School, I'll just suggest you a really good book, The Grand Hotel Abyss, by Stuart Jeffries, came out fairly recently. This is a brilliant, very readable guide to the Frankfurt School. Now, before we get into the facts of the Frankfurt School, we could just say a couple of things briefly. We've just come across Walter Benjamin just now, a Jewish intellectual, and many prominent people within the Frankfurt School were Jewish intellectuals. Their work, which, although it begins in the 20s, really comes to the fore in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, into the into the 60s, is in many ways a response to Nazism, but it's also a response to the possibility of democracy and of workers' organizations in a changing world, where work is changing, where consumerism is changing. And what characterizes the Frankfurt School more than many other traditions within left-wing political thought is its pessimism. And a not unjustified pessimism. I'll give you a quote from Max Horkheimer. He's writing in 1940 to a friend. In view of what is now threatening to engulf Europe and perhaps the world, our work is essentially designed to pass things down through the night that is approaching. A kind of message in a bottle. Max Horkheimer. Now, Max Horkheimer is just on the left, this image that you see here. The man who our attention is drawn to is Theodor Adorno, perhaps the major figure in the Frankfurt School. So, the Frankfurt School, what's it about? Well, it's founded in 1923 in Germany, in what is then the Weimar Republic, a new state with a social democratic government, so kind of centre-left government. And the Frankfurt School itself becomes associated with the University of Frankfurt, but it's initially begun by intellectuals who are interested in the conditions and possibility of socialism in a changing world, a bit like what I sketched out, I guess. Now, it's founded in 1923, so this is 6 years after when the Russian Revolution begins, but 4 years after the failed Spartacist revolution in Germany. And one of its questions is, why had socialist revolutions failed in the West? How had capitalism become so popular with workers? Remember, Karl Marx spends much of his life living in London. Friedrich Engels, a factory owner in Manchester, writes about the working class in England. Their assumption, and it was a good one for the 19th century, was that communism would begin in England. It would begin in the United Kingdom, but it didn't. And though the Labour Party did have a lot of electoral success from the start of the 20th century, capitalism was still very much in power. Why was it still popular with workers? What was it offering? I spoke before of this, kind of the mix, Freud plus Marx equals Frankfurt. A question for it later, from the late 30s, is where did fascism come from? Had it just come from nowhere? Was it a German condition? Now, this is definitely not what they think. For them, it's got deeper historical roots. So, it's founded in 1923, and there's like a couple of generations, I suppose, but really we're interested in the first generation. I've got on the images here, on this slide, Walter Benjamin, top left, Herbert Marcuse, we'll talk about him a lot later, on the right. Bottom left, Erich Fromm, and then bottom right, unless I've gone mad, I think this is another image of Max Horkheimer. So whilst it's in the Weimar Republic from 1923, it leaves Germany, I guess, fairly quickly. From 1930, which is when Max Horkheimer takes over as director, and when it becomes into the identifiable Frankfurt School that we're interested in, from 1930, it begins to move out of Germany. It moves first to the Netherlands and then to Geneva, Switzerland, 1933, because of the anticipation, rightly, that they wouldn't be able to continue their work and they wouldn't be safe under the Nazis. From 1934, they moved to the United States. They're based at Columbia University. Then during the war, many of them moved to the west coast of the United States. It's only really much later, after the Second War, that they moved back to Frankfurt. Now, there's a second generation that come after our key guys. Jürgen Habermas is probably the most important. Axel Honneth is enough and much later. We're not going to look at them. Lots of people find them interesting, but generally there is a drift away from Marxism there. I really like the first generation a lot more. Okay, so one of the things that Horkheimer does is he sets out what he calls critical theory. Now, you've probably heard this phrase critical theory before. People might talk about it. This is a book of critical theory. I'm interested in critical theory. And maybe you thought to yourself, because I thought this, what does that actually mean? Is it just theory that's kind of critical to the state of play? Well, this term critical theory comes from Max Horkheimer, who in an essay from 1937 called Traditional and Critical Theory, sets out what he considers to be the purpose of theory. And yeah, it's critical, as you can guess, but it tells us something about what the Frankfurt School are really trying to do. So Horkheimer tells us that a critical theory is not like a traditional one in that it's trying to change the world. As Horkheimer says, it differs to the extent that it seeks human, quote, emancipation from slavery. It aims to act as a, again, quote, liberating influence to create a world which satisfies the needs and powers of human beings. Sounds great. Okay, we might want to just keep in mind here what a traditional theory would be doing. A traditional theory isn't trying to change the world or emancipate us from slavery. Maybe a traditional theory wouldn't claim that there is such a universal condition as freedom or slavery. It would just describe things. What Horkheimer is looking for is something that's more ambitious, and we can understand that in the circumstances of a world that has been broken by the First World War, then by a huge economic crash, then by the rise of the Nazis, and then later by the death camps. The need that theory can't just be fiddling while Rome burns; it has to do something more. Now, Horkheimer says that critical theory needs to fulfill these three functions. It needs to be explanatory, practical, and normative. It basically needs to explain things. It needs to kind of locate what people can do about them, and then it needs to kind of have some sort of sense of how things should change. Now, critical theory isn't just its goal isn't just achieving a Marxist republic. Actually, its goal is to achieve democracy. Horkheimer calls this real democracy. Now, how this would fit in with a Marxist project or a socialist project is the idea of economic democracy, which maybe isn't so radical. The idea that the employees, the workers of an organization, should have control of what that organization does and what it makes and what it produces and how it operates. And maybe they should also have a fairer share in the proceeds. If they have a fairer share and are able to participate more in its structures and direction, maybe that organization would work more effectively. It doesn't sound that radical, does it? And that's basically socialism, what I'm sketching out here. That's a socialist form of organizing the workplace. So this is one part of critical theory, but there's something that isn't so easy here. Now that's that question. Maybe when we deal with Germany in the 30s, that's one thing. But there is an undeniable pessimism to what the critical theorists have got in mind, especially after the Second World War, especially with the rise of the consumer society, which they saw when they were in exile in the United States. New goods, new products, new desires. The masses seeming pacified and happy by Hollywood, McCarthyism, new fridges. Maybe we're not going to get revolution, the kind of revolution that Karl Marx talked about. Maybe we're not going to see the workers take over. This kind of strain of pessimism appears from the 40s and becomes palpable in the 50s and 60s. Maybe we can't achieve social transformation. Maybe capitalism is too powerful. Maybe all the gadgets and gizmos are too good. We can't snap people out of it. Now, what's interesting is that the Frankfurt School move from just a critique of totalitarianism off, say, Germany or Russia as a kind of thing, to applying this to Western capitalism, to Western democracy. Imagine inverted commas around that. For Horkheimer, for Adorno, the United States of the late 40s and 50s, the UK of the late 40s and 50s, and as they would probably say, these countries ever since, are not free. They're not free. Capitalism has eliminated the space for freedom. We think we're free, we think we're autonomous, but we're under very powerful illusions. We think that technology has given us many more options, given us unlimited possibilities. But how come all roads lead back to boring, drudgerous work and unhappy lives? Maybe all of this talk of, conquering nature and reason, its whole purpose was to just instill a capitalist work ethic. We think we're free, we're just dupes. This is something that we're going to explore. Now, what's curious with what Adorno and Horkheimer do is that as they're developing this line of inquiry, they look back. And they look back to the 18th century, and this is our next part. To hell with the Enlightenment. Okay, why? What's so bad about the Enlightenment? What's that done? Wasn't it meant to be really good? Well, when we think of the Enlightenment, what are we talking about? We're talking about philosophers like Immanuel Kant, like Rousseau, like Diderot. We're talking about revolutions like that in America, when it became independent as a colony from Great Britain, or the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. Enlightenment was about all human beings being equal by nature, in theory. It was about conquering nature and achieving human peace and happiness. It was all of its ideas inform what we now call liberalism, that all individuals possess certain rights, inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the American Revolution. Now, as Horkheimer and Adorno say in Dialectic of Enlightenment, 1947, you can see that in front of you there. Enlightenment, understood in the widest sense as the advance of thought, has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters. Yeah, they're not disputing that. And also, in case you're worried, they're not going to say that Enlightenment itself is a bad thing. Far from it. What their aim is to identify contradictions within Enlightenment thinking, which end up not being liberating but being repressive. And as they write, book comes out in 1947. They're writing during and after the Second World War. They're dealing with the barbarism that Benjamin describes. How did that come about? As they say, yet the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. Now, this is very unexpected. It probably isn't what Immanuel Kant imagined. Of course, we have to be a bit wary of conflating the two. So let's try and work out the argument. How do we link Kant to the death camps? Enlightenment thinking, loosely, was meant to be about liberating human beings, giving them the power to conquer nature, making it possible through science and technology that, in the words of Francis Bacon, man could become master of nature. Now, Immanuel Kant, in his essay, What is Enlightenment?, describes enlightenment as man's release from his self-incurred immaturity. This is usually translated to self-incurred tutelage, but tutelage is a bit of an archaic word. So it's us becoming less immature, self-incurred, us becoming more powerful, more capable, conquering nature, developing new political forms, industrializing. Now, all of this was meant to free us, wasn't it? All that technology, all those new social organizations. We were going to dominate nature, but it's going to be in order to create a paradise on earth for human beings. But what if it's that completely the after effect? That's the stance of this book. It's a brilliant book, Dialectic of Enlightenment. Usually it's recommended as one of the first places to go to understand the Frankfurt School, but It's quite a hard book to read, so that's why I've decided to set you guys Marcuse as one-dimensional man. But if you're interested in this stuff, this will be the next place to turn. Now let's think about why they critique enlightenment. Like I said, they're not against enlightenment, they're not against reason, but they think that there's something within reason with a capital R which could be self-destructive. And that's when we think about history in a dialectical way. Now, you'll remember the idea of the dialectic from last week when we looked at Hegel and the idea of human progress being accomplished in a certain direction, a certain progressive direction, but one that isn't necessarily linear, that we may proceed in a good direction, a more progressive direction, but then there is reaction, there is counter-reformation, there is obstacles, there is opposition. But over time, that opposition is synthesized and incorporated, and we're becoming more knowledgeable, more aware. Now, Horkheimer and Adorno want us to think slightly differently. Let's think about where societies have gone since the late 18th century into the 19th and into the 20th. We've had industrialization, we've had the rise of mass bureaucracy, we've had the vast expansion of European empires into different parts of the world. Now, all of that technology and bureaucracy and industrialization has brought us to, let's say, the early 20th century in the Ford line, Fordism, the Ford conveyor belt. Workers are under more control. Their work is less skilled. They have less political power. They seem to have less social power. In the words of Horkheimer and Adorno, we're going towards a totally administered society, administration and bureaucracy everywhere, suffocating human freedom. Now, reason was meant to liberate us from this, but all it's created is new forms of control, new forms of discipline, new ways of work, new ways of pleasure, new ways of consumption, in which our fundamental freedom, I guess, to think and decide for ourselves and to direct our own lives and our communities with others, have both been curtailed. Democracy has been curtailed. Everything has kind of been eaten up by a wider economic logic. Now, this is 1947. Let's think, 70, 80 years on. 80, where would that be? 27, not there yet, 70 years on. Well, if you think about globalization, automation, and the way that our work has changed, well, they would say that things have gone even more in this direction, greater administration, greater control, greater discipline, and universal solidarity is suffocated. Now, a big part of the dialectic of enlightenment is looking at myth and what myths tell us about society and how myths change. So they decide to look at the myth of Odysseus, sometimes translated as Ulysses, Odysseus, and in ancient Greek culture, and his journey home. And when he's trying to travel back to his home, one part of it is he's on a voyage and he needs to cross a sea. And in the sea are the sirens, and these beautiful and enchanting young women who sing these songs. Now, when sailors hear these songs, they're so entranced, they climb out of their boats and into the sea and they drown. The sirens, therefore, are very dangerous to sailors, very dangerous to anybody who crosses the sea. But Odysseus wants to hear the sirens because this is going to be the most entrancing, intoxicating music that any human being could possibly hear. So what he does, and you'll see this in the image, his sailors, they've all got this sort of bandages around their heads. Their ears are plugged up, so they can't hear, and all they have to do is row and row. But he orders the sailors to tie him up to the mast, and you can see that there as well, so that he can hear the sirens, but he cannot leave the mast. He won't be able to go into the sea and follow them. It's a great story, isn't it? So let's see what Horkheimer and Adorno make of this. Well, they very interestingly see this as a parable for the modern bourgeois hero, the modern bourgeois man, the modern middle class man or woman. And what this tells us, I'll quote: "The sailors stop their ears with wax so they can continue the work of rowing their ship, just as modern labourers discipline themselves, repressing their sensuality and desire for gratification in order to keep working." Further, so Odysseus, they describe him as the Enlightenment bourgeois subject because he domesticates not just nature but himself. What do they mean by that? Quote: "Odysseus is the first bourgeois hero, one whose treacherous journey involves risks that justify profits, one who uses reason, trickery, self-renunciation, and self-discipline to survive. So, in tying himself to the mast, this would seem that he is kind of mastered nature, really, mastered the dangers, the threats of nature. But what he does instead is bring about a series of tricks or processes that define modern bourgeois life, middle class life. Yes, the same thing, the self-denial, self-renunciation, self-discipline, but also trickery, also using reason, using a calculating and instrumental reason to make profits. To make profits over the labourers who are forced to kind of defer their own pleasure so that someone else can. Isn't that like the factory owner versus the factory labourers? Why do those factory workers keep doing it? Why do they keep working for low pay? Why do the sailors keep rowing? Another part of the Dialectic of Enlightenment is a section on what Adorno and Horkheimer call the culture industry. Now, this isn't to do with Greek myth or the Enlightenment. This is about 1940s America. And it makes some very interesting and very critical points about the effects of advertising and the effects of popular culture. Now, this from Motorola is a brand new hi-fi in a very space-age looking apartment. The lively art of electronics. Now, our exiles, remember, Benjamin doesn't make it out of Europe, but Adorno and Horkheimer do. It's Horkheimer who gets Benjamin the visa to leave France via Spain, but he never makes it. They're in exile in America, surrounded by American consumer culture and advertising. Now, what do these gadgets and new products offer us? Well, they claim to offer... they don't aim to just satisfy our basic needs. They're not just about, trying to kind of deal with our fundamental hunger or need for shelter. Instead, they usually, if they're really good, offer us something much different. They offer us something a lot more powerful. They offer us personality. They promise to make us sexually attractive. They promise to make us successes. We can see that here with these adverts for these new Chevy cars and the different social types who can buy a car that matches their personality. The office worker with the hat. The I don't know what these people are on the bottom left, like good time folk. There's a young family on the right, and there's a couple of guys going golfing in a sports car. Another one. Now, these cars are all different, aren't they? Maybe they're not. Maybe they are just all fairly similar Chevrolet cars. This certainly is the perspective of Adorno and Horkheimer. They basically call bullshit on this. Quote, "We had the freedom to choose what was always the same." All of this is similar. Whereas consumer culture, whereas the new gadgets promise to liberate us, to excite us, to electrify our lives, what they really do overall, the effect that they achieve, is they pacify workers, they coerce and manipulate workers into staying at work, into working longer and longer hours, more and more jobs, maybe even getting into more and more debt, so that the cogs of capitalism continue. And they don't just produce profits for shareholders and dividends. The aim isn't just to produce wealth at the top, the aim is to produce a society in which that wealth production is made possible, and you produce that society by making your workforce as docile and passive as you can. And that's what they're looking at. What does personality mean in a society like this? I'll quote Adorno and Horkheimer again. "Personality scarcely signifies anything more than shining white teeth and freedom from body odor and emotions." Now, of course, everything's moved on, hasn't it, since the 40s and 50s, None of this applies to us, right? Let me give you another quote. This one is very timely. "The triumph of advertising in the culture industry is that consumers feel compelled to buy and use its products, even though they see through them." What's really powerful about about the Frankfurt School, reading the Frankfurt School, is the way that they seem to be describing very prophetically our own capitalism today. And we've had interesting terms for it in more recent, left-wing political writing. You might have heard of capitalist realism by Mark Fisher. I don't know how aware Mark Fisher was of the Frankfurt School. I imagine quite a bit. But a lot of his ideas indirectly are drawing on ideas like this, but putting them into an early 21st century context. That many of us can see that capitalism is a scam, that the workers are exploited, that the environment is being destroyed, that consumerism is kind of stupid. But we think that, there's no point trying to resist it. It's impossible. We see through it. We know it's flawed, but we just carry on. We still work. We take on more jobs. We get into more debt. Why? Well, there's sometimes a problem with this kind of line of thinking, that it tends to come from very bohemian and often very middle-class radicals who have got the possibility of pontificating about how the masses are duped, while they have usually some private income source, which means that they don't need to worry about work themselves. And speaking of somebody who, who sees through capitalism but works all the damn time, why? In many ways, it's fear. Fear, the same kind of fear that compelled people to, if not support Nazism, then at least not do much to prevent its rise to power. Let's hear from Bertolt Brecht, an upper exile from Germany into the United States. Now he's talking about Hollywood here. Every morning to earn my bread, quote, I go to the market where lies are bought. Hopefully I take my place among the sellers. We work because we have to. In the meantime, we see what we can get out of the gadgets and gizmos. Ultimately, all we do is reinforce a system that immiserates us. It's bonkers, isn't it? Now, Adorno and Horkheimer talk about films of the day, usually in quite amusing ways. And again, there's a real cynicism about how things work, and what we think is happening versus what is really happening. And so, as they analyse it, all Hollywood films have got the same top-down formula. And these Hollywood films, we could think about Marvel films or whatever today, they're teaching a lesson. It's not an explicit lesson. It's not about a singing nun, or, I don't know, kind of a sexually promiscuous woman or anything like this. They're teaching us lessons about how we can resist and how we must acquiesce. Adorno and Horkheimer. As soon as the film begins, it is quite clear how it will end, and who will be rewarded, punished, or forgotten. In light of music, once the trained ear has heard the first notes of the hit song, it can guess what is coming and feel flattered when it does come. All of this is all too familiar. It's all too boring. Now, this predictable popular culture in pop music, in film, in magazines and so on, it's depoliticized the working class. It's limited how people can imagine the horizon of political and economic change. And just as it dampens our expectations and gives us kind of amusing distractions, so capitalism, the cogs of capitalism, just keep turning very effectively. Sometimes in the culture industry, some of the criticisms are quite, they're funny, but they're quite fogey-ish, maybe, or maybe not. So they talk about Donald Duck. Donald Duck, what's he done wrong? Well, Donald Duck, for Adorno, is someone who also teaches us the parables of capitalist obedience. Because every time he's beaten or punished or humiliated, it's a way of reinforcing how we can take our own punishment, our own belittling and humiliation by the boss in our workplaces, by kind of laughing at it. Adorno. They hammer into every brain the old lessons that continuous friction, the breaking down of all individual resistance, is the condition of life in this society. Donald Duck in the cartoons and the unfortunate in real life get their thrashing so that the audience can learn to take their own punishment. Here's Adorno posing. In the early 50s, Fyodor Adorno goes back to Germany, and then he does some more research in California, and he researches astrology columns. So not astronomy, but astrology, kind of, reading your stars in, newspapers. You get these nowadays, of course. Fortune telling. And it's interesting what he kind of pulls out of this. The images here are fortune telling machines. You can have your personality read. As long as it's a yes/no question, you can find out whether you should take a vacation or whether you'll make money or if your position is secure. Now, these actually are the questions that a Marxist analysis would help you with, but instead, we're going to put some money into a machine and ask Swami. Now, Adorno, when he analyzes all of these newspaper columns, he says, well, ultimately, all they do is, quote, the purpose is, quote, promoting conventional, conformist, and contented attitudes. Things are beyond our power. Let's look to the stars. But at the same time, they're always so predictable and so boring, these columns. Adorno is quite funny about popular culture. He's often very, very dismissive of things. So here is Adorno talking about laughter. He doesn't like laughter, okay? And imagine here kind of like goofy comedies in films and television. He says, quote, fun is a medicinal bath. The pleasure industry never fails to prescribe it. It makes laughter the instrument of the fraud practiced on happiness. Moments of happiness, he means here, real happiness, are without laughter. So don't laugh. In the false society, laughter is a disease which has attacked happiness and is drawing it into its worthless totality. Pacify. Okay. I shouldn't laugh today. AM and PM. He also analyzes the way that AM and PM, like kind of morning and afternoon, are represented in different ways in magazines and so on. And this goes back to the astrology columns, where usually they would the defining feature that AM is about work and PM is about pleasure. So Adorno says that AM is work, reality, and the ego principle. PM is for the instinctual urges, the pleasure principle. But again, there is something ulterior happening here. That when the astrology columns talk about, treating yourself, indulging yourself in the afternoon, all they really are serving to do, quote, all they ultimately serve to do, quote, is the ulterior purpose of success and self-promotion. Now, if treating yourself, if pampering yourself becomes a kind of recommendation, fortune columns, it becomes, in his words, a kind of duty or a form of work. Now, why would pampering yourself, why pleasure this sort be a form of work? Because ultimately, our desires are fulfilled by consumption. So let's think about our 1950s, late 1940s housewife. I don't know, in the background is a wide choice of things. They all look really similar, don't they? But there's a real choice. Maybe there isn't a real choice. If we think about the Frankfurt School as an analysis today, they would help us question our own consumption habits. Why is it that we shop? Who wants you to shop? Like, what kind of forces, advertising, social, encourage us to consume, to treat ourselves once in a while, to pamper ourselves? And why do they do it? How does advertising work? Well, as the Frankfurt School are going to really emphasize, they do emphasize, is that these aren't about things that we really need, but they're about new desires that are created. They create new desires, false needs in us, to distract us from our underlying and real desire for freedom which cannot be accommodated by a capitalist system. And in that process, they take away our individuality, what makes us us. And in the words of Herbert Hoover, American president, he says this approvingly, they transform us into constantly moving happiness machines. Should we become happiness machines? What does a machine do? A machine works, a machine consumes. A machine is automated, a machine does not think for itself. This is the machinery of minds that the Frankfurt School is talking about in the 20th century. Now maybe this is not what we want. As Adorno and Horkheimer say, mankind, instead of entering into a truly human condition, is sinking into a new kind of barbarism. Which gets us to Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse, and the idea of being one-dimensional, for barbarism, which is also about an impoverished life. Now, I mentioned earlier the fusion of Freud and Marx. We've already had Marx, I guess, in mind here in the analysis of capitalism, and capitalism being understood as something that is inherently repressive of workers. But where does Freud come in? Let's bring him in. So some of you will know Sigmund Freud in different ways. You might know his work well, or you may not. Freud's major contribution to how we think is the idea of the unconscious mind. Now, Freud says that the unconscious drives most of our behavior, not reason. We may think our rational minds with free will are directing affairs, but no, they're not. What we think in our minds consciously, that voice in your head, your consciousness, is your ego. It's only one part of your mind. It's a presentation in your mind of your desires, of your drives, in a way that is acceptable, not just to your mind and your experience, but also acceptable to the morality in which you've been socialized into by your society and by your parents. Because a big thing with Freud, as you'll probably know, is the emphasis on child sexuality. Now, as Freud sees it, all infants seek a pleasure seeking. From our youngest age, we have a libido, we have a kind of pleasure drive, what will become eventually our sex drive. But this kind of, like polymorphous hedonism of the child has to be repressed. It's not repressed, at the age of 10 or 14. It's repressed at the age of 2 or 3. Because the child must be trained to become civilized. And civilization involves not being able to always get what you want, not being able to have your mother for yourself. That pleasure seeking is repressed, and out of this emerges morality. Our drives and desires go underground. They're the id, the unconscious, the most powerful part of our minds. But we don't have direct access. Because one thing that makes the unconscious really interesting is that it does its best to remain unconscious. It's not pre-conscious. It doesn't want to become conscious. It does everything can actually to not become conscious. And that's one of the things with Freud. Remember, he's a psychoanalyst. He is working as a therapist. He's trying to help people deal with their neuroses. And he says that lots of people, men and women's neuroses, stem from their sexual drives in a way that these sexual drives have been kind of blocked up or have been kind of suppressed and rechanneled into different directions. Now, I'm using that phrase channel or suppress, which almost suggests like water, water going through pipes, like a kind of force that must go somewhere. And that is the way to think about what Freud is saying. Now, we have this kind of libido, this powerful energy in us, and it has to go somewhere. If it can't go into sexual pleasure, sexual fulfillment, then it must be channeled somewhere else. Now, human nature for Freud is violent, it's aggressive. We seek pleasure, that puts us into conflict with other people, and we want to squash them. But we cannot do that. We have been trained to be good, morally upstanding individuals. So what happens next? Freud talks about repression in that sense. From the earliest ages up into adult life, we have to repress these drives, these instincts. Now, this isn't a bad thing. If we didn't repress them, then society wouldn't function in any way. Freud says that, and he calls this sublimation, this taking of the primal and making it civilized. He says this sublimation makes it possible for higher psychical activities, scientific, artistic, or ideological, to play such an important part in civilized life. What motivates the philosopher, the artist, the intellectual, the scientist? Well, part of it, a big part of Freud is saying, is that they have this libido, this power, these powerful drives, which they cannot satisfy because the possibility isn't there for satisfying it in a way that is possible. So instead they're channeled into different directions to different pursuits. He makes a distinction in a really good book, a really interesting book called Civilization and Its Discontent, which I'll say more about in a second, between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. The pleasure principle is wanting that pleasure, like the small infant, wanting it all the time. But the reality principle is what we are socialized into. Reality isn't about pleasure and satisfaction all the time. Reality is about having to forego pleasure. It's about having to keep working. Work must go on. And that's the price to pay for civilization. Freud He's quite a pessimist about human nature, about human civilization. Repression is inevitable. It serves a social good. We're always going to be unhappy, basically. Freud says in this book. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. What we call happiness in the strictest sense comes from the preferably sudden satisfaction of needs which have been dammed up to a high degree, and it is from its nature only possible as an episodic phenomenon. We are so made that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. Thus, our possibilities of happiness are already restricted by our constitution. Unhappiness is much less difficult to experience. That's a very interesting formula, isn't it? We're happier being unhappier. We're more used to it. Now, Freud is writing in the early 1930s, and one of his followers in the school of psychoanalysis is Wilhelm Reich, who ends up leaving psychoanalysis and doing his own thing. Now, Reich doesn't share this view that human beings are inherently violent, and he believes that human nature is inherently peaceful and loving and affectionate. Maybe repression isn't intrinsically a good thing. Maybe while some repression and some sublimation is useful for us peacefully coexisting in some way, maybe the ultimate cost is that it does make us more violent. Whereas Freud is saying that violence comes at the very beginning, Reich says, actually, hold on a minute. Violence is a result of repression. Because we are unsatisfied, that means that we develop what he calls secondary drives. We find other ways to satisfy them. Money, sports, the sports car, the new suit, a new dress, a new sofa. All of these things are, well, they're not just distractions, but they're powerful ways of us finding pleasure indirectly. But again, Reich says the problem is where this goes. In his view, popular culture, and he's writing in the 30s, 40s, has become more sexualized. We can see more sex being represented more and more on the screen, if not directly, then indirectly. But just as we can enjoy these kind of scandals and risque tales, actually what they involve instead is a repression of our deeper sexual nature, because we project and identify things which don't themselves involve our own sexual fulfillment. Where's all this going? So Reich in 1933 or 34 writes a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is dealing with fairly similar stuff to what the Frankfurt School set out to do. And again, his point is that the masses did desire fascism, and that's because authoritarianism could offer something really powerful. Hitler offered something really powerful. What made the Nazis so compelling is that support for the Nazis was based on a deep repression of sexuality among all German people, men and women. It was a feature of their society, their patriarchal, authoritarian family structure, their lack of sexual education. And because of a lack of opportunities for sexual pleasure, instead these sex drives were kind of sublimated, remember that term from Freud, and identified instead with Hitler. The masses loved Hitler. He could act, he was active, they were passive, he led, they were willing to be led. Now, Reich is a very interesting one. You might also know about the orgon machines of the 40s. These wooden boxes with metal lining that you could sit inside and they would give you more powerful orgasms. Reich does kind of lose it a bit in later life, and he comes up with a machine that he thinks can affect the weather and affect clouds. And this becomes the influence of a Kate Bush song, Cloud Busting. Because you're wondering about the Kate Bush link. But Reich, let's go back to that, the idea that civilization and reactionary politics are based on the repression of sex drives. I know it might seem a bit far out, but this is what Marcuse is going to take up, Herbert Marcuse. He does this in two ways, in two books. The 1955 book, Eros and Civilization, and then what we're going to talk about, 1964, I think, One-Dimensional Man. Now, Marcuse, he is also off the Frankfurt School, like our other guys, but he becomes more to the fore later on. Horkheimer and Adorno are in the United States from the mid-1930s. and they're still teaching. They you know, they're kind of still teaching and developing their work. But what Marcuse does when he gets to America is he says, I want to work for what basically becomes the CIA. And he is working for the American government with his aim is to defeat Nazism. So he's working for the American military in a kind of research role. And he comes back to teaching later on from the early 1950s. Now, Marcuse is a good one for thinking about the Freudo-Marxist synthesis. So Marcuse thinks, like Freud, not like Reich, that some repression is useful. We need, in order for society to function, we need to repress some of our basic instincts. Otherwise, we're just going to, either molest or kill everybody. So we need some repression for morality. But let's not take it too far. This is the right point. He calls it surplus repression. We can have basic repression, which is fine. But surplus repression is when too much is repressed, more than is necessary. Where we are willing to forego fulfilling our own needs and desires in order to work longer, in order to feed into what he calls the performance principle, being productive at work, being productive in your life. Now, Marcuse is interesting because he challenges what he sees as a tendency in philosophy that we sometimes take for granted, and in politics, which is that work is a good thing. This goes back to Hegel. It probably goes back much earlier. That human consciousness and identity is defined in terms of production and activity. It's about making and becoming through what you work and through what you make. Karl Marx, when he is talking about the overthrow of capitalism, it's not so that everyone doesn't work anymore. It's so that we carry on working, but we're no longer alienated in our work. But hold on a minute. All of this talk about work and identity in work, and work being a pleasure, not a chore, and non-alienate work. Where's it going? Marcuse says, hold on a minute. This is just capitalism, man. If the goal is just to make us more productive, then this is exactly what capitalism strives for, to keep producing gadgets on low wages so that other people can buy those gadgets, or to keep producing advertising, or to keep propping up social structures so that the gadgets, so that the services continue and everything continues as it was before. Again, the point that I made earlier, we need to think about capitalism here not just in terms of the profits for shareholders or the very wealthy, the aristocrats at the top, but how it produces ways of thinking among the whole population that make them docile and passive, that keep the whole thing going. How is it that we become like robots? Marcuse. Quote. This is from Eros and Civilization. The performance principle, which is that often acquisitive and antagonistic society in the process of constant expansion, presupposes a long development during which domination has been increasingly rationalized. For the vast majority of the population, the scope and mode of satisfaction are determined by their own labor. But their labor is work for an apparatus which they do not control, which operates as an independent power to which individuals must submit if they want to live. And it becomes, the more alien, the more specialized the division of labor becomes. Men do not live their own lives, but perform pre-established functions. While they work, they do not fulfill their own needs and faculties, but work in alienation. We're all just little robots. We are the happiness machines that Hoover was talking about. Now, this is from 55, and Marcuse continues in this line in One-Dimensional Man, which is what we're going to discuss. Now, Marcuse raises a question which had been bothering Adorno and Horkheimer, which is, why hadn't class struggle turned out the way that Marx had predicted? Where's the revolutions? Come on, the year is 1964, or he was probably writing this and saying 1962. Surely by now, over 100 years since the Communist Manifesto, there should be revolutions all over the place. The big point about Marxism was that capitalism is inherently contradictory. It will inevitably collapse. The workers will inevitably want power. But they don't. Why is that? So that's what One-Dimensional Man is setting out to do. It's looking at Marx and Freud, and it's looking at how Western capitalism, how American, British capitalism had managed to buy off the workers, had pacified them, had used consumption, advertising. How in our society it seems like we can get everything we want. But all of these consumer options, these new phones, new gadgets, new shoes, do we need them? Or are they false needs? Do they satisfy us, or the moment we have them, do we long for something else? And is that because we're longing for something that cannot be fulfilled by the clothing or the gadgets or anything else like this? Marcuse calls this repressive desublimation. And that's an interesting term, isn't it? Repressive desublimation. So remember, sublimation is when the pleasure drives are channeled upwards into civilized activities like art or politics or whatever. Now Marcuse is saying that this has gone the other way, that workers have been encouraged not to think, not to be artistic or musical or intellectually ambitious. There's been a desublimation. Popular culture has been sexualized. There's kind of sex stories, pornography, sex in popular music. It's everywhere. Sex is everywhere. But is that leading to happier or more fulfilled lives? He thinks not. This is the repressive role. So when somebody like Macmillan in England, in the UK, I think this is 1957, maybe it's earlier, that British people had never had it so good. In a certain sense, that was true. But according to someone like Marcuse, they'd never had it any worse. They'd never been any more alienated than they have been. They may believe that they're free, that they can decide to work in one factory or another, that they can do one degree at university or another. But all roads end with the continued reproduction of capitalism. Now Marcuse says that when we dream about the gadgets and the things we want, our own identity disappears. Quote, in one-dimensional society, we mistake ourselves for our consumer durables. The people recognize themselves in their commodities. They find their souls in their automobiles, hi-fi sets, split-level homes, kitchen equipment. Let's think about what we saw earlier, the hi-fi sets and so on. Now, of course, none of this applies nowadays, does it? It's all irrelevant. Or not. What are the status of these things? Off the new smartphone. Off sourdough bread. Marcuse. The products indoctrinate and manipulate. They promote a false consciousness which is immune against its falsehood. And as these beneficial products become available to more individuals in more social classes, the indoctrination they carry ceases to be publicity. It becomes a way of life. It is a good way of life, much better than before, and as a good way of life, it militates against qualitative change. Now, there's something else happening in that remark too, isn't there? That Macmillan was right. Compared to 60 years ago, 100 years ago, workers in 1950s Britain had never had it so good. These new fridges and gadgets were brilliant. They had improved the lives of women. They'd improved people's lives in different ways. Things have become much more convenient. It was a good way of life. That's why it militates against change. Why would you reject this stuff? But what he's trying to get at is that indoctrination isn't explicit. It's not about ideas that people speak with their tongues. It's about ways of life and the effect of those ways of life. Now, Marcuse was very popular with the 1960s student protest movement that begins with opposition to the Vietnam War, becomes mixed up with the civil rights movement, and then becomes entangled in all sorts. We'll talk about this in a few weeks, and we'll look at May 1968. Apparently, one banner at the time said, Marx, Mao, Marcuse. Now, other people in the Frankfurt School ended up finding themselves, curiously, the target of the student protesters, in particular Theodor Adorno, and we'll look at this in a few weeks' time. Marcuse is very popular. Why? Well, there could be some things here: the critique of consumer society, of bourgeois middle-class society, the emphasis on sex and free love, and what that meant in the society where new opportunities in contraception and liberalizations around sexuality were making more and more things possible. But Marcuse, like the Frankfurt School, he is pessimistic about the old-fashioned working class, the blue-collar factory worker, affecting change. As far as he's concerned, it's not going to happen. Don't look to the proletariat. They've got their gadgets. They've bought in. So Marcuse instead locates the collective subject of political change elsewhere. He sees it in people that have been kind of excluded in different ways from the system. He highlights artists. intellectuals, outcasts and outsiders. He talks about what he calls the great refusal. Now, in particular in the arts, you might think here of art, film or music, that the arts present something really powerful culturally. He quote, "They are an elementary force which violates the rules of the game and in doing so reveals it as a rigged game." We can think about this in the way that in the UK nowadays there is a movement to cut back quite significantly on education in the humanities and the arts because they're not seen as economically useful careers. Now, that's Marcuse would say this is a political assault from the Tories to the arts. They don't want to fund the arts because the arts and the way that artists live and the way that artists ask us to live and to think isn't just about consumption, isn't just about us being passive. We are active, we produce, we design, we feel. We don't just keep buying gadgets. Now, there could be something a bit wary about trusting it all to artists or intellectuals, and we'll come back to this, the charge of vanguardism. But Marcuse was tapping into some interesting things. On the one hand, the student protest movement, but on the other, the rise of things like the Black Panther Party. And one of his students was Angela Davis, who was also involved in the Black Panther Party in different ways. Marcuse thinks we've got to look to the outcasts for change. Quote, "The substratum of outcasts and outsiders, the exploited and persecuted of other races and other colours, the unemployed and the unemployable, they exist outside the democratic process. Their life is the most immediate and the most real need for ending intolerable conditions and institutions." So it's an interesting one to think about where this critique goes. If it's critiquing the way all of us live, and the way we consume, then that seems to suggest that change needs to be on all of us. But Marcuse, like many Frankfurt School, is pessimistic. He doesn't think that we're going to wake up. So instead, it's only those that are already excluded and marginalised who can be expected to resist in different ways. Ultimately, Marcuse points to the need for utopian thinking, even amid the worst barbarism. In an essay towards the end of his life, the end of his career, an essay on liberation, he talks about the need for utopian thinking, and I think this need is very pertinent now. He says, "What is denounced as utopian is no longer that which has no place and cannot have any place in the historical universe, but rather that which is blocked from coming about by the power of the established societies. Utopian possibilities are inherent in the technical and technological forces of advanced capitalism and socialism. The rational utilization of these forces on a global scale would terminate poverty and scarcity within a very foreseeable future." We've heard this sort of rhetoric in different ways. Let's think here about John Maynard Keynes, certainly not a radical, but somebody who wanted to reconstruct capitalism in the early 20th century. He envisioned a world with a very short working week, maybe no more than 8 hours a week. In more recent times, there has been a talk of luxury communism, a world of what Mark Fisher, who I mentioned earlier, called post-capitalist desire. That a post-capitalist world is within our grasp, but it can't just be about going beyond capitalism. It has to involve a transformation in our understandings of work. We have the technology, he's writing in the 60s, to feed the world, to house the world. Why aren't we using it? We have the wealth to give everyone a decent quality of life. Why aren't we using it? The utopian possibilities are there. And maybe that goes back to the role of artists or intellectuals or visionaries to remind and to challenge, to get us to think about those possibilities. Now, one final thing. Marcuse is, well, if not a feminist, certainly says a lot about the dangers of masculine values dominating society. Not just in terms of militarism and war and aggression, but also in the ethos that it's good to be competitive, what we might now associate with social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. He wants to see a decline of these values in favour of what he calls explicitly feminine values, of a world that is more peaceful and more cooperative and more loving. It's interesting to think about what that would entail too. And the way that Marcuse was of such use to late 1960s radicalism. He's a great writer, and I hope you'll make use of Marcuse after this. Okay, right, let's wrap it up. This has been a bit of a long one. So for our discussion on Monday, I've got 3 questions that I'd like us to cover. The first relates just to the reading. What does Marcuse mean by one-dimensionality? What does he mean? What's his analysis trying to get at? And then more broadly, drawing on this talk that I've given, why was the social analysis of the Frankfurt School so critical of Western capitalist societies? Let's think here about their connections with fascism, the talk of popular culture and consumerism. And then, how do we apply the analyses of the Frankfurt School today? This will be a really interesting one for us to talk about. So this is when we next meet and talk. Monday 25th of May. It's a bank holiday, but I want to run a class then, so that we keep the momentum going on our class. And also this course is like part of the last teaching I'm going to do at Murray Ward Centre, so I want this to flow, it'll be really interesting, blah, blah, blah. Okay, right. So for week 3, our following week, we're going to look at Michel Foucault. We're going to look at Madness and Civilization, a work from the early 1960s. I think we're going to look at chapter 2, but I'm going to decide on the reading before our next class. But I'm also going to recommend to you an interview that it gives called Truth and Power, which is also fantastic. Okay, right, well, this is it from me. Thanks so much, everyone. And yeah, I look forward to theorising the demise of capitalism with you on Monday. Thank you very much. Take care.